This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional lives. And that journey often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of general audiences. Interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that? Go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. It is such a great pleasure to have Dr. Holly Falk-Krzesinski on the show today. Holly is the Vice President, Research Intelligence within the Global Strategic Networks team at Elsevier, a leading firm in information and analytics for customers across the global reach and health ecosystems. Holly focuses on giving voice to research leaders at universities, funders, and science policy organizations to help Elsevier deliver the most impactful research information to support evaluating research performance and impact, among other related topics. Holly is co-chair of the Gender Equity Task Force and actively involved in Elsevier's executive level inclusion and diversity efforts, advocating for greater gender diversity among STEM leadership and promoting sex and gender-based analysis in published scientific studies. Prior to joining Elsevier, Holly was a faculty member and administrator at Northwestern University, where she launched the Office of Research Development to facilitate interdisciplinary collaborative grant proposals. She also helped launch the Chicago Collaboration for Women in STEM program. For more than a decade, Holly has been an influential contributor to a growing community of research development professionals with significant leadership roles with the National Organization of Research Development Professionals, or NORDP, and the International Network for the Science of Team Science. Holly earned her Ph.D. at Loyola University's Chicago Stritch School of Medicine in microbiology and immunology, and her B.S. in biological sciences and chemistry from the University of Illinois at Chicago. You know, Holly, your academic journey is so inspiring, and I would love for you to describe for listeners how you move forward from being the first in your family to graduate college and, of course, grad school, of course, to your college experience and extended internship in industry, and then grad school where you earned your PhD. If you could share that, I know that listeners would be interested to hear about your journey.
Okay, so it actually even started before college. I fell in love with biology, and in particular molecular biology, as a freshman in high school. And from that moment on, I decided what I was going to pursue was a degree in biology and was really very excited about it, and research in particular. So this amazing high school teacher who spoke in terms not just of what we were learning in the textbook, but about the experiments and the research that led us to the conclusions that were then presented as facts in our textbooks. And I was really excited about that. And I loved any of the experiments that we did as part of class, as opposed to what we were necessarily reading and things we had to memorize. So I did really well in that regard and was super excited. So by the time I was done with high school, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Now, I was the first in my family to finish and graduate college. Both my mom and dad had started college, but neither of them finished for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. But what was really important to them is that their children all go to and complete college. My dad especially, I think, thought that he was held back in his career because he didn't have a college degree. And I think that I would agree with that. And so from a pretty early age, we were inspired to do so. And beyond inspiration, I would say my parents also supported my undergraduate career. So they paid in full so that when I finished college, I didn't have any student debt. to contend with. And that was a really big deal. It also meant that there were lots of opportunities for me along the way. So that, for example, when I was a second semester freshman in college, and there was an opportunity for me to consider an internship, I didn't need to worry how much money that internship was going to pay. I mean, it ended up paying really well. It was at Abbott Laboratories, so it paid very well. But I wasn't burdened with having to think about, oh my God, I have to pay tuition bills. And I will forever be grateful to my parents for giving me the gift of college in that regard, because it really allowed me to be able to be flexible and think about what was going to be in my best interest for my own career pathway. And so that internship at Abbott Laboratories was because there was a visiting professor in one of my biology classes. And she came in and told us about herself, and then said when she had office hours, and invited us to come and see her, even if it wasn't to talk about the class per se. And I was really fortunate because I was paying attention to where there were opportunities. I actually, just before this, switched universities. So I switched colleges after only one semester, because I was very unhappy at university number one. So now I was first term university number two. And perhaps that made me more attuned to when opportunities were going to be presented. And I took her up on it. And that conversation turned into my internship opportunity. And then I really wanted not just to just do the work, but build relationships at Abbott, because one day I might want to work there. And that enabled me to secure an extended internship, so that the group invited me to come back and work on all of my breaks from school. So I worked on all of my winter breaks for the 3 months over the summer, and also on spring breaks. And so all told, then throughout my career in college, I actually managed to do about 1 full year worth of internship at Abbott Laboratories, which was extraordinary. And really extraordinary because of what I studied. And we were looking at developing drugs against HIV/AIDS. This was in the very late 80s, early 90s. So this was a very big deal. And I'm proud to say that I was part of teams that developed drugs that are still part of the standard AIDS drug regimen. So really exciting to do that. But how extraordinary, really early on in my career, that I had this grand opportunity. And I didn't know it then, but I do now, that understand that it was a great opportunity to work outside of academia, which I now advise people to do. That it's great to go to graduate school. It's great to even go right from college into graduate school, but then somewhere along the way, you need time out of academia, even if you plan to go into academia as your career, for example, as a tenure track faculty member, because working in a different sector from the university was so important, and a very different way for me to think about science, how science is done, how science is paid for, and the motivations behind it. And I was so grateful to the people that I worked with on the team at Abbott, that they shared that kind of insight with me, so that at 19, 20 years old, I was taking that kind of information in, that then helped to inform going to graduate school and wanting to earn my PhD. And it was actually the people that I worked with during my internship that convinced me that I wanted to get my PhD, so needed to go into graduate school, because I wanted to be part of the team, or the individual in charge of making the plans for what the science was going to do, instead of only being somebody who would receive that information and then act. I wanted a leadership role, in other words. And in fact, one of my colleagues who had finished her academic training with a terminal master's degree told me why it is she decided not to pursue her PhD, and then said it was for all of those reasons that she thought that I absolutely should go on to pursue my PhD. And it was really, without judgment, and just being really encouraging, one professional to another, me much earlier in my career stage than her. And that was it. And so I decided to go, that I wanted to get my PhD. I wanted to understand how to lead and conduct science. And at first, I really wanted to stay in the same kinds of field. I then came to realize, though, that earning a PhD means really deeply understanding how science is done, which means that you can do lots of different kinds of science. And that was going to come in handy for me later on. And then after I finished my PhD work, it was still kind of par for the course that you should go on and do a postdoc. And I decided then to switch and do a postdoc in a different kind of field. So I had been working in microbiology and working with prokaryotic organisms. And so I intentionally selected a cell biology oriented postdoc so that I could then extend my scientific and technical skills beyond what I had already achieved during my doctoral training. I also selected a university where I could do some teaching because I love teaching. And I had really picked that up while I was a graduate student. Interestingly, at a university where I was on a campus with only graduate students and medical students and graduate nursing students, so no undergrads. But this is where I found out that I just love to teach. And so I picked a university with a strong undergraduate component so that I could engage in undergraduate teaching as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I was so glad to have done that. But really, what was telling is in my PhD training, when I thought that I might actually pursue a teaching career right out of graduate school, and I told my then advisor that I was really interested in it. And, maybe something like a small liberal arts and science college or a community college would be a good fit for me. He actually said to me, well, you can do that, but it's a waste of your potential and my time. Which was another reason that I went on to do my postdoc, because I just thought, well, I'm supposed to do a postdoc. In hindsight, I now understand that was not necessary for me. But nonetheless, I was still glad I did it.
Yeah. Well, hold on. I just want to pause for one quick second because your voice is fading in and out a little bit. I think it might be because you may be moving around a little. I'm not sure if you're using a headset or a mic, but I can hear you really well. And then all of a sudden it's a little softer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Where about would you like me to, I can redo
we can edit. Yeah, I think what'll probably happen is in the post-production, I can do some leveling. So that let's not worry about re-recording afterwards. If it doesn't sound good, we'll deal with it. But I think we're okay. And then any kind of rustling or anything like that is getting picked up as well. So just if you can try to, but the content is so great. And so we'll pick it up. I'm going to ask you actually if how that made you feel when your advisor said that, if you want to answer that question. I know it's not on here.
Yeah, but no, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So we're good to go. Actually, Holly, what I wanted to ask you is how you felt when your advisor said that pathway would actually not be completely maximizing your potential and would be wasting his time.
Yeah, deep disappointment in him as my advisor for not providing me the kind of guidance I was asking for. But then also in myself, did I not pay close enough attention all of these years? Was I not on track to do something and these expectations that others have for you? So it was a little challenging and I didn't want to disappoint. One, because, well, I'm a little bit of a people pleaser. So that was always, that's always been part of my personality, although I work at that. But then also there's this power issue, and that when you are that early in your career and still a grad student, your advisor holds a tremendous amount of power over you, including future letters of recommendation for career posts. And I didn't want to disappoint, and I didn't want to risk that he wasn't going to provide the strongest possible letters of recommendation. So that was really the impetus then for saying, okay, then I'm going to go ahead and do a postdoc, and at least for some time, he would think that I was continuing along a track that he thought was the right track for me to be on. It was really by about 6 months into my postdoc, though, that I then came to really clearly understand that I had a good hold on what I wanted my career track to be and what I didn't want it to be. And that was not it. And I did not want to pursue a career running my own independent laboratory. And I had never really wanted to do that. And now I felt empowered at that point to really stand up for myself.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. And, I want to ask you, you've touched upon some really key attributes and attitudes that you had during this part of your journey that made you so successful. Certainly opportunistic. You recognize this opportunity to go to office hours, and then that leads to the Abbott Lab experience, and then of course your talents during that internship lead them to want to extend and offer that for you so that you continue to work there. I wonder if you could share with listeners, what kind of attributes, attitudes, approaches that, in addition, or even modifying what I've taken away from your responses so far, if that's needed, that they should be thinking about as they are, driving forward in their careers.
Sure. I think first and foremost is being willing to take advantage of opportunities when they're presented to you. So first, maybe a precursor of that is you have to be prepared that opportunities are going to be presented to you all of the time, but nobody's going to announce, I'm now about to present an opportunity to you. Ta-da! So opportunities come your way all the time, but that means you have to be paying attention all of the time. Getting a good sense of what direction you're heading in, the environment in which you're working, and how opportunities can be presented to you. And then when they are, taking advantage of them, moving forward, not taking them for granted. They're never going to be handed on a golden platter. And once they're presented, they're probably not going to be offered again. And this was really important to me. And it could be that would help me as I went from being a pretty traditional college student to one that was non-traditional. I switched from a traditional live on campus university experience to one where I was attending college, but living back at home. And I was at a university that had a very high number of commuter students and adult college students. And it just dawned on me that I needed to take control of my own career trajectory. After all, these are people who were working full time and also putting themselves through college. These are people who had life experience and then made a decision to go back to college. And I just thought, in some cases, colleagues shared with me that they only wish they had earlier on. And I was in this really privileged position of being able to do so earlier on. So I took advantage of those. The other thing is that I was never overly concerned with what I don't know. And that's because I knew that I could learn it. I was always really good at school, and I really love learning. I have a passion for learning about things in science and about things outside of science as well, but especially within science. Good chance if I didn't know something, it was going to intrigue me so much that it was going to be very exciting to learn about a new direction. So I never really worried about what I didn't know because I felt that I was equipped to gain the skills and knowledge about things that I didn't know in as much depth. And so perhaps I wasn't put off by opportunities where I wasn't a perfect fit from the beginning, but rather that they were opportunities that I could use to fulfill rather than fit.
You've made a really important point there related to this hunger to learn new things, as well as your curiosity and not being put off by what you don't know, which I think is just so important, because sometimes we are wanting to stay in our own little comfort zone and not venture out, maybe because we don't think we are experts in these other areas and we therefore shouldn't play in those domains, so to speak. But you have found such success really taking the opposite approach, that it's an opportunity to learn new things. And as a result, you've been so successful at all these different opportunities, talking about whether it's postdoc to non-tenure faculty fellowship to research development professional, and starting a new national organization of research development professionals, editor-in-chief at AWIS Magazine, Association for Women in Science, and other stops that you have made. And when you think about that journey so far, and I know you've touched on some of these things, but what are some of the big themes, would you say, that run through your approach to these different positions?
Yeah, I think one of the guiding principles for me in my career pathway is really my desire to advance science and scientists, if you will. So I think that that's been really important to me. So whatever the positions that I'm looking at, and whatever the career or particular job opportunity is, will I be able to advance science and scientists? And I've been offered in a few occasions jobs that were outside of this set of scientific job strengths. And I've considered them, but I realized that part of it also then is my passion for work and what I want to achieve working with other people. And that perhaps I could have done those jobs really well because I had the right skill set, but I would be missing this piece that is my passion. And going back to fell in love with molecular biology and research as a high school freshman, that passion hasn't reduced in any way at any time during my career. So it was really easy for me to think along each place, is this a new opportunity for me to advance science and scientists? And especially, can I excel at it? So for example, I think one of the reasons I didn't want to pursue maybe having my own independent lab is, well, I thought I was good technically at the bench and good in science in that way. I actually didn't think that I was extraordinary. And I thought, well, why would anybody pursue something if you didn't think that you could be extraordinary at it? And so I was also looking for the ways in which I could be extraordinary in the things that I'm doing. Maybe I set the bar really high for myself, but that's what I was looking at, as I didn't want to be mediocre in what I was doing. So at least aim for being extraordinary in the things that I could do, which then has offered me the opportunity to think more broadly. So not thinking about one particular job pathway, but rather about these ways to be passionate and advance science and scientists. And so those were guiding principles. The other thing is that, look, we're always working in the context of an organization and employers and others that we're working with. And so I do also pay close attention to stakeholders' needs. So for example, at the university, when I was working with a lot of researchers and investigators and faculty members on interdisciplinary research opportunities, large scale grant opportunities, and especially if we were going to be crossing from the sciences to engineering and in medicine, I realized there were a lot of resources needed and we couldn't continue to put the burden on the individual faculty to get these things done. And so I really thought, well, what resources can I help to create that will support these already overburdened, really busy people who conduct such elegant science and help to advance our knowledge, and especially in terms of technological advancements or translating into medicine, for example. And that's what compelled me to propose a research development unit and to have some central administration resources made available to the faculty. What could we do in service to the faculty, who after all are paying indirect costs on their grants? How do we help reinvest those monies that they can continue to move forward without just adding more to their plates? And that's really exciting for me too. So it's always with this connection to what others need and want, in addition to the things that I want to achieve in my own career.
And it sounds like that, we had this chance to talk offline earlier, and you referred to that blend as sort of your rocket fuel that's really propelled you forward.
Yeah. And I think, just being really passionate about people, right? So it turns out I also really love people. Science being at the center of the things that I'm doing. And that, just other people's interests and priorities, especially when they've been my employer, right? Trying to do something that you're really passionate about, even in an important area of science, if that doesn't align with the priorities of your employer at the time, probably not going to get very far, because somebody wants to pay for the things that matter to them as well. And so kind of trying to find that sweet spot is really important.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Hai, that you phrase it that way too, because there's always a lot of talk about relationship building. And sometimes that can be a squishy term. People get a sense that it's important. Maybe it means networking, which can be, kind of a term people loathe. But I would say that just being focused, aware and focused on the other stakeholders in your universe that impact your position is a really important part of relationship building. And you've really explained it in a way that I think is so accessible to listeners.
Thank you.
You've also described your approach to leadership, because you've been a leader for so many years now, and you've certainly been successful at it, and you've developed some principles that you follow. We've talked about your approach, but you've also mentioned service leadership, and not during our conversation just yet today, but earlier. And I would like you to share what you mean by that term, and why do you think it's effective and fulfilling?
Yeah, so service leadership, it is. So this is my preferred MO, collaboration, networking, service leadership. It's the way in which I best like to engage with other people. Mm-hmm. One, because I really like other people a lot. I'm such a people person. So I guess I always in thinking about that I'm in service to other people. And as we've just talked about, taking into consideration other stakeholders' needs and being really cognizant of those as you're working on things. But it's a term that's borrowed from the clergy and from religious organizations, mm-hmm. such as churches and synagogues. And for a lot of my recent adult life, I've also spent in parallel working as a volunteer at my synagogue. Mm-hmm. And so these ideas of service leadership, and I started thinking and learning more about them as well. But I think that what this does is affords us the way to work with others that helps bring out the best in other people. And when you do that, you're the very best leader that you can be. And so going back to being, starting up this Office of Research Development, I was never going to be conducting any of the science. I wasn't going to be leading any of the interdisciplinary research centers. But if I could work with my faculty, my tenure line faculty colleagues, because I was a non-tenure line faculty member, if I could work with them to develop something that was strikingly competitive, and we could be awarded a $25 million grant proposal or grant award to sponsor an interdisciplinary research center. If I could work with them to achieve that, then they would be really successful, and the science and those scientists could be advanced. And that's where I derive my greatest joys and pleasure and satisfaction from the work that I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Much more so than, for example, any extraordinary experiment that I ever did at the bench on my own. And perhaps the lows of science for me were really, really deep lows. And the highs never quite came up and peaked high enough to overcome those lows of experimentation gone wrong. But I find that I don't have nearly the same kind of lows when I'm working with other people and helping them to make their way to meet their best potential, to bring people together so that what they develop together is more than simply the sum of their individual parts, and that the collective carries more power. Those things for me are really fulfilling. And so there's just this natural fit. What I take the greatest joy from and the greatest amount of just being appreciative of what I'm working on and satisfaction overall, then align with service leadership in that way. And perhaps that's it, is that my way of thinking about working with other people then is also how I think that I advance and get ahead, so they go closest together. And then there's been an easy fit for me.
So interesting. Thank you for delving into that and explaining it to listeners. I want to ask you, as we wrap up, Holly, what your priority projects are right now. It's clear that you remain just as passionate about your work as you were when you were that freshman in high school learning biology. I actually really enjoyed my freshman biology class too. And I'm wondering, what is exciting you at work these days?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, these issues around that we're seeing about trust in science. Mm-hmm. So sort of going back down to the core, why is science so important? And that's because it provides empirical evidence and the data to help us indicate what's most likely. What are the most reasonable explanations for why something happens, how things work, how to combat things. And so it's this tied empirical evidence and data that really matter to me. So being involved in issues related to the trust in science matter a lot, which doesn't mean that people should give up, asking critical questions and critical thinking. And I think that's really important that we continue to advance critical thinking skills. And that's part of science and scientific evidence. So those are very important. Mm-hmm. Some of the other things that I'm really interested in is thinking about how is it that institutions and scientists best convey the impact of their research, and especially that which is societally relevant. Mm-hmm. And I'm really intrigued at this idea of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and that framework, and that it really is an amazing framework for being able to describe societally relevant research impact. So I'm working on some projects around that. Mm-hmm. And then one of the other big things that I'm involved in is working to increase diversity, inclusion, and equity in research, especially around issues of gender diversity and inclusion and promoting women in science, but also dimensions of diversity and inclusion such as race and ethnicity as well. So, but with a very strong focus on gender. And I think while I've always thought that was important, we've seen during the COVID pandemic that we can't become complacent when it comes to issues of advancing women in science. There have been gains that have been made, but those gains were fragile. And in fact, we've now seen just how fast and how far those gains can be rolled back if we're not putting in the effort to advance those gains and to accelerate them. So those are some of the other things that I'm working on.
I want to ask you a follow-up on what you talked about with respect to trust, because this is a big area that I'm fascinated in and that I work in as well, which is, how scientists relate to the public, how the public responds to scientists. You talked about the importance of sharing impact, which I think sometimes gets lost. So the relevance of the work to the average person can be camouflaged in all of these details and technical words that the public doesn't understand. I'd love to get your perspectives on where we are sort of with societal trust in science, and thinking back across your career, maybe how it compares to those moments, in your previous work, how they may compare with respect to trust in science, to today's environment.
Yeah, I think the trust in science has been waning in most recent years, much more so than I can recall in any of my professional career before now. While I think that it was to some extent issues related to science and how science can inform or impact policy decisions, I think that there was always a politicization of that, but politics have come into play in a much bigger and in my opinion, obscene way. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that those two should be equated directly with one another. It is also important that scientists understand that policy is not made by science alone, right? So you can have scientifically informed policy, you can have evidence-informed policy, but we have to remember that those are not the only factors that go into policy decision makings. In the same vein, we need to understand, I think the public has to understand that there's a tremendous amount of science and not just one experiment or one finding that, for example, go into guidance around public health issues. And I, to be honest, I'm not exactly sure where the failings is. I don't know if, for example, we're not doing an adequate enough job of teaching how science gets done when we're teaching science in school. As I talked about my own freshman biology teacher, I thought he did an amazing job of equating the way we would do research and experiments and how they told us things that we then considered scientific fact that we read about in these textbooks, the knowledge that we were supposed to take at face value at that point, so that we could understand how that knowledge came to be. And perhaps that's not being done as well as need to, so that everybody has some good, strong scientific literacy base. And I'm not sure if that's it. I do think that the politics that anybody will then politicize anything about science. And if somebody uses science to support their policy initiative, then the individuals in another political party will immediately politicize that and say just the opposite, and then try to discredit the individual and come up with bizarre things around science. They're really discrediting the politics, but then they're doing it and they're weaponizing, if you will, science in that regard. So I think that's where we have a problem. So we need trust in science. We need to be able to move it out of the political arena and aim to keep these things as separate as possible. That means that we have to speak with authority, but also understand the stakeholders who we're presenting to and be aware of things that they may not understand. And therefore, when people don't understand things, they are often afraid of them, right, or they will be less likely to trust them because they don't have a full understanding.
Right. So many important points there. Just a couple that I picked out that I wanted to highlight. I'd like to highlight are, this lack of understanding about how science gets done. I mean, as sort of I interpret that with respect to the pandemic, was sort of like, okay, well, look, this is something new. We're trying to figure out what's going on with this virus. We're going to come up with some scientific reactions or conclusions or these tentative findings as we start to learn this. So for example, you should be concerned about whether the virus could spread through contact, surfaces and with others. And so, I remember wiping down grocery bags in our house, right?
Yep.
But as we learn more, we realized that, and I actually just saw this stat earlier this week, that the chances of contracting coronavirus through a surface-to-surface contact is about the same as getting struck by lightning.
Right, and it's not, and of course, Mark, it's not that anybody did an about face,
right?
They didn't change their mind. What it is there was more data that informed decisions that could be made. And, this is also a difference of, public policy, public health policy. They need to be considered when you don't know, and sometimes then you have to err on the side of caution for the sake of public health.
Right.
And we also have to remember that individual health is different than public health, but understand how deeply those two are interrelated. And that's the other thing that we've really seen is this idea about individual rights. Mm-hmm. I don't know, to me, that's really, really bizarre, because I think we all have the right to be able to live as well and as healthy as we possibly can, and that we owe that to one another. But that's this other thing, is that these very political ideas are being brought into science, and we need to step away from that, and we need to ensure that we're taking the political conversations away from the scientific conversations.
Yeah, this is a subject that fascinates me as a political person and as someone who works so closely with scientists now. But I agree with you 100%. It wasn't an about face on the surface to surface, but of course it was portrayed as that. But maybe some of that, maybe I was going to say inoculating against that sort of perception is a little bit of expectations management that wasn't done. Not enough of this is what we know so far. It might change. Letting people know up front.
It is. I mean, at the same time, look, I will say our public health officials and lawmakers and government, our governor, any of our local governing structures, they needed to make some decisions kind of fast. And so sometimes, they were erring on the side of caution because they didn't know enough just yet.
Sure.
And that's okay. I do think that we started to see it's where they were inviting scientists to come in and present during these press conferences, and understanding now we're going to be informed by. I do think that we should be careful about terms like data driven as opposed to data informed. Mm-hmm. And again, this understanding that when you're thinking about policy, it isn't only the data and the science that go into it. There are other components, like how human beings are going to behave. And it turns out that sometimes we human beings don't behave the way we should.
Right.
And so you have to take this sort of practicality about it being human beings, and we can't actually control everybody. Right. So I like to think about, being informed instead of driven by. And where there are limitations to those things as well, but where they can also tell us and guide us in such important ways. Mm-hmm. So that, for example, we are not all spending time wiping down our groceries any longer, which made life a lot easier for us. And it made the ways in which we had to continue wearing masks and staying home a little easier to cope with, because at least we could unpack our groceries
right.
Without fear.
Right, of course, yeah. And we didn't view it sort of as a step back or a mistake or anything like that. It was very much in a line of, look, we're trying to figure this out in real time. I don't think enough of that message was kind of broadcast more widely, so that folks, it was easier to portray, well, they don't know what they're doing on this, and so then you can't listen to them on anything. Very easy to demagogue at that point. But such interesting and rich conversation. Dr. Holly Falk-Krzesinski, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us and share these really deep insights from so many domains that you have been leading in. And I know that it's going to be really informative to listeners, many of whom are starting out and much earlier in their careers. So thank you for sharing your perspectives and your nuggets of wisdom.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it. And I'm glad I was able to, especially if it can provide any guidance to early career researchers and thinking about how they're planning out their career journeys. I'm delighted if I can offer any guidance to that group, especially.
Great. And I know that it will. And listeners, thank you so much for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.